but it's Rich Wilson. Hello, Rich. Nice to have you.
Hello.
Yeah, and so you were previously the lead level designer at Arkane Studios and helped create Prey Mooncrash. You've been working on Immersive Sims for over a decade. I know you've moved on to new things at this point. I'm not sure if that's something that you want to give the details on, or if it's still a little up in the air. But
yeah, I'm currently doing level design at Archetype Entertainment here in Austin.
Yeah, excellent. And you're here to talk to us about Roguelikes, Immersive Sims, and the Church of Simulation, which I just love as a phrase. So, yeah, take it away.
All right, thanks. This is my talk, Roguelikes, Immersive Sims, and the Church of the Simulation. And this is basically using Mooncrash, my experience on Mooncrash, as a kind of focus to talk about my experience building immersive sims and the ways that I think simulation can produce the strongest player experiences. It's also about the kinship between immersive sims and roguelikes that kind of became apparent as I was working on the project, and these sort of similarities that bubbled up. It's also about limitations and opportunities that we came across when bringing roguelike elements into a sort of AAA gaming space with higher fidelity representation and things like that. There will be a lot of examples from development on the project, as well as lots of little tangents that spiral off here and there. I'm coming from an immersive sim background. I know this is a roguelike conference, so I'm presenting my observations as an outsider, and I humbly bow before the roguelike experts here. A bit about me, we kind of covered this already, but I've got 13-ish years experience working on immersive sims, 17 total in the industry, going back to BioShock 2, Dishonored, and Prey. I am a casual enjoyer of roguelikes and roguelites, and a fan of procedural generation as a technology in general. So all these things kind of were a happy confluence for me when working on Mooncrash. For starters, just a bit of background and primer on some terminology and things like that. So immersive sims, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with what an immersive sim is, but I thought it might be useful to give my sort of lens on what they are, given my experience, and just to make sure everyone's on the same page. As you can see here from this, this little diagram, I don't know where the diagram's over there. You can see there are lots of different, games that kind of fall under the umbrella. But my sort of basic blanket term is something that takes simulation depth from something like Dwarf Fortress, maybe not quite as deep as Dwarf Fortress, but marrying that with the sort of immediacy and embodiment and presence of a first-person shooter like Wolfenstein, right? And so you've got many games that kind of fall under this category. I don't know if I have a cursor here to point at things, but you can see in the upper right corner there, the sort of progenitor of all this, the Ultima Underworld. And then a lot of the games, Far Cry 2, System Shock 1 and 2, etc., that follow this trend. And what that simulation depth means is that enemy NPCs have an organic awareness model instead of just knowing where the player is at all times. They don't spawn and shoot directly at you. They can, they have vision cones and things like that. You may have things like elemental propagation, like fire through grass, or electricity through water, or things like that, instead of it just being like a particle effect with a damage volume on it. Things of that nature, right? And again, this creates lots of fuzzy boundaries. If you look at Breath of the Wild, is Breath of the Wild an immersive sim? Is Job Simulator an immersive sim? Things like that. This is where the sort of church of the simulation kind of comes into play. Both immersive sims and roguelikes rely heavily on simulation and math to kind of determine outcomes. And often as emergent results of systems colliding with each other and stuff like that. I think there is a sort of capital T truth to the outcomes of these systems as they interact with one another that you don't get from more quote unquote cinematic games. If an event occurs because of systems, then it actually happened in this sort of microcosmic reality, whereas anything else is just someone telling you about it happening, right? It's it happens the same way every time. It's an accounting of a tale rather than something legitimately occurring, if that makes any sense. And I think that this can result in dramatic failures as well as dramatic triumphs, and these player stories that come out of this are very powerful. There's an article called "The Dice Can Kill You" on Polygon talking about first edition AD&D, and there's this anecdote about a wizard that was the final surviving party member, and they cast a disintegration spell on a goddess who had 95% magic resistance and a saving throw of 2 or better or something like that. And because of the luck of the dice and the tenacity of the wizard, they disintegrated a goddess and won the scenario, or survived or whatever. And this resonated with them, and they, it's the kind of thing, if you have D&D friends, you hear this kind of stuff all the time. But it's the kind of thing that you talk about for years to come because of the sheer audacity of the situation, and the fact that it, again, it's not something the dungeon master said happened. It's something that happened because of systems, impartial, systems, basically. So in Immersive Sims, a lot of this stuff comes about through something we call systemic design. These slides here are from a talk that Randy and Harvey Smith gave around 2004. You can find it on the GDC Vault. Might be it's on YouTube as well. But the gist is that anything in the world that is placed is placed as the sort of full representation of itself, right? So if you see a gas can, it's not just a static mesh. Like anytime you place the gas can, it is a gas can, and that means it can explode or be picked up and dropped or be used to fuel things or whatever. It has systemic properties, right? And so, one way to handle this is to, like in the top slide there, is to hard code interactions between every single thing in your game and everything that could possibly interact with. And that's brittle and time consuming, and it means you're less inclined to add stuff to your game because of the combinatorial workload that's required. But instead, what immersive sims try to do is distill that stuff down into this sort of stimuli that they produce, and then things that can respond to stimuli. So, both the flaming arrow and the candle produce fire, and that is a system, that is a sort of systemic signal element. And then there are certain things that respond to fire, like a torch might light, or an oil puddle might ignite, or whatever. So if you get a situation where someone shoots a guard and the guard's standing over an oil puddle and they drop a torch and the torch ignites the puddle, that all happens through systems instead of someone very precariously hard coding a sequence of events, like with trigger volumes or something like that. So that's where you get this sort of the honesty of the simulation sort of informing the structure of the game and the world and things like that. And the systems, they free you from this sort of brittle, handcrafted interactions system, or not system, the brittle, handcrafted interactions that you could code or script or whatever, that make every new situation, a big headache to author and things like that. And they break in a million ways if they're not systemic. Now, occasionally, on Dishonored, we had many situations where there are these extravagant situations that characters are involved in. Usually NPCs are the ones that sort of force us into scripting, because you can't make NPCs systemically think about the world that well yet. But so I had a situation in my mission where one character was trying to poison other characters, and it resulted in what I call systemish design, where scripting of these dramatic authored scenarios needs to marry up with systems, right? You have these systems that are out here doing their own thing, and then you've got this one area that's like, okay, well, I want this to be kind of constrained, or these sequences of events to happen within this system. So the poisoning consists of a wine bottle and 2 wine glasses, and you can come in the room beforehand and mess around with it and switch the poison or whatever you want to do. But the problem, or the problem to solve, was the fact that the bottle and the glasses were bottles and glasses, right? They weren't just meshes depicting a bottle and glasses. They were bottles and glasses. And throughout the game, anywhere those are placed, they can be broken because you're wielding a sword and a crossbow and things like that. So there was a crossroads here. What to do? And because of where I worked, and because of my sort of penchant for self-punishment, I was going to support those things being breakable, right? Because a player could drop in, break that, and then what happens, right? The poisoning scene can't just go off the same way. So what happens? And so I ended up scripting listeners to listen for the things being broken, and then when the characters get to a certain point in their walk around the room, then there's a branch, basically. And is this broken? Is it not broken? And then there's a whole backup plan where the guy lures him down to the basement and stabs him in the back instead. And then I went back, because the interaction was a context menu, I went back and took Spill the Glasses and added that to the little context menu, because I'd already put the work in on it. So why not surface it more for more players to kind of discover and see what happens, right? So in this case, this is, again, the sort of church of the simulation asserting itself. The authored content bows to the simulation. Now, things must be changed, things must be updated, and so forth. It's a game designer, legendary game designer, Chris Crawford, who this is him at GDC back in '92 before he galloped out of the industry altogether with his sword brandished like you do. He's currently working on, I think he's still working on procedural storytelling stuff with Storytron and things like that. But he coined this term that I really like called process intensity. And the gist of it is, process intensity is the degree to which a program uses processes instead of data, and sort of emphasizing that games are better at processes than data, right? Better at sort of making branches and supporting choices and stuff than pushing around animations or images or things like that. And I think Immersive Sims embody this content, sort of pulling the content towards the systems end of the spectrum. I think this is also something that can go wrong if you misuse the concept of branches and loops and things like that. You can get what I call the threat of infinite content. This is more stuff that I was thinking about when working on Mooncrash. But just because you can make something loop 1,000 times doesn't mean you should make it loop 1,000 times. Just because you could procedurally populate a warehouse with crates that the player has to search, doesn't mean you should, right? And it's not necessarily like evil, but there could be this part of you that's like, yeah, I want to give the player more gameplay, hours and hours of gameplay. But there's this sort of zealotry that can emerge when you're tinkering with these kinds of things to try and make them express themselves in the most extreme way, I guess. All right, next up, some stuff from Mooncrash. So Mooncrash, it was a DLC for our Immersive Sim Prey. Took a lot of the Immersive Sim tenets and introduced some roguelike elements to it. We used this framing story that the player is a hacker trying to break into a simulation of a moon base. That way we had our nice framing story so we could have our sort of static narrative being told while all the loopy system stuff is happening safely contained within. So it was kind of like having our cake and eating it too. The player has to escape from the moon simulation 5 different ways with 5 different characters, among other things, but that's the sort of thrust of the whole experience. We didn't start with roguelikes as a thing to dissect and incorporate necessarily. We just wanted to come up with economic ways to create new and interesting experiences. And we were playing, some of us were playing like Darkest Dungeon, Rogue Legacy, Risk of Rain, stuff like that at the time. And so there were lots of ideas like, hey, this could fit in, this could, be applied and such. And in the process of doing that, we had this sort of two genres that were sort of smashing together, like peanut butter and chocolate or whatever. And some ideas very neatly fit within that Venn slice in the middle, for Mooncrash. And then there were some things that we were trying to get in from either angle. Like, what if there were a more, authored narrative for drama purposes or whatever, or what if there were more procedural generation or something like that. And some things just did not quite slot in there due to, mechanics, theme, budget, stuff like that. One of the first major things we talked about was death and replay. I mean, the whole thing is about loops, death and loops. And so, we basically explored lots of different options, and we distilled everything down to 2 models that we ended up calling the Spelunky and Rogue Legacy models. I realize there are lots of other games that do similar kinds of things with their death and stuff like that, but those are just the ones we settled on. So the Spelunky model was, okay, the game is stateless, right? You can play this thing over and over and over again. Every time you play it, it starts from the start, ignoring the shortcuts and whatever. In Spelunky, it is basically like a sport or like a session-based kind of thing. They have the daily challenge and stuff like that. We even thought about daily challenges and things of that nature. That was one model. And then on the other hand, we had the Rogue Legacy model, where death is kind of brought inside the systems with persistence. There's progress towards an ultimate goal that you don't just get the first time through. I'm sure people probably could, but you're ultimately trying to do something far-reaching, and you're getting there through multiple deaths through playing through the game, right? So we took this idea and ran with that for our game, and for various reasons I'll mention soon, I guess. So we incorporated that, and we went an additional step, having multiple characters that you could play. So now you have this meta progression on top, but then you've got sort of loops within loops. So yeah, so the characters, you unlock them as you play. Inspiration partially from Risk of Rain, mostly from Risk of Rain, honestly, but also like Maniac Mansion, maybe just in my head, but that was something that kind of loomed large in my background. But when one character dies, you play with, or escapes, I guess, you play with another character, and they kind of step in exactly where the last one left off. So you get this accountability and sort of long range player agency where your choices then impact your next self, who can then make choices and impact your next self, and so forth, until all 5 of the characters either escape or die, and then the whole simulation resets and you start over. There's some meta progression currency and stuff that you can use to sort of beef up your characters and give them more options, sort of like Rogue Legacy. But the simulation itself resets, and so all the escapes reset, doors relock or unlock, and things like that, right? But yeah, they pick up in the same world where the last one left off, and so you get this interesting choice structure where you can have a whole lot of loot as one character, and then you could escape on a shuttle and take all that stuff with you. And then your remaining selves don't have access to that stuff because the base is a finite resource. So every drawer you loot is now empty for the rest of the run. So you have to make choices. Or your character could have all this stuff and then die, and then be resurrected as a monster that your next self has to fight to get that stuff, if that's your what you want to do, basically. So another aspect from roguelikes we dabbled with and took on in a certain way was randomization. So we didn't go full-on procedural generation just because of technical constraints and expertise constraints and things like that. But because of the looping structure, we wanted to have variation in the spaces because we didn't want it to be dry. We didn't want this, repeatedly going through the exact same space over and over and over again, and experiencing the exact same thing. So, yeah, we had limitations on the kind of content we could do, or the amount of content we could make, and amount of variability, because it was all authored. We would turn on and off layers and things like that, and we had this robust sort of serialized random number system that we authored just for this game, where there would be just a chain of so it could be deterministic. We had a chain of random numbers that would say, okay, what is this level's fire index? Okay, this time around it's 2. And then it would, set it up based off of fire index 2 and stuff like that. And then sometimes there were choices that branched within those. But anyway, so you can see here, and this speaks to the sort of fidelity choices or fidelity issues I was talking about earlier, where we wanted to adhere to a certain quality of art. So that meant that if something is burning, then they want to have pipes jutting out of the wall, or the stair banisters being melted or burned down or whatever. So that means there is an overhead to each of those choices. I think in the long run, what we came up with was pretty good, because if we had a more granular or had much more art bandwidth, then we would come across what I ended up calling the chopped salad effect. And Kate Compton wrote about the 10,000 bowls of oatmeal problem, and I think it's a very similar sort of thing, where if we had all these different channels of randomization in every single level, like the moon base is a few levels ringing a center crater level. But yeah, so if you have all these different little random elements in one level, these are, this depiction is hazards, basically. So like flooding, radiation, fire, etc. If you've got all these different sort of representations of those in one level, you go to the next level and you get that same sort of mix. It becomes indistinguishable, right? It's like a bite of a chopped salad. It's like it tastes the same. You get the same experiential effect level to level. So we ended up making it chunkier. So this level's mostly fire, this level's mostly radiation, and then there were like 3 or 4 variations of that. So when you come back to the fire version of that level later, it'll be a bit different. But that kept it chunkier, basically. So there was a more experiential, or a greater experiential difference going from one to the other. And then on top of that, because like I said, we had an overarching progress, to the narrative and to the completion of the game. We added hazards and variation as you go. So we, in the beginning, it's pretty calm, and then we add elements and stuff like that, until at the end, it's this kind of fever pitch. But you've had time to sort of accustom yourself. Anyway, get accustomed to all the elements at play. Finally, akin to roguelikes as well, we incorporated high-level player goals. So instead of micromanaging the player or providing an objective structure as you progress through the space, it was this checklist of things you need to do. And the big thing on the checklist was the 5 escapes run. So in one run of the simulation, escape with 5 people in 5 different ways, or the 5 ways you have available, right? And so that was kind of like this puzzle box thing you had to kind of figure out as you go. But again, like roguelikes do this a lot, where it's like, okay, get to the bottom of the dungeon, get to all the way through this scenario alive. And so we kind of embrace that. Also, we do that at a smaller scale in Immersive Sims a lot, where it's like, get in this room, get to this place. We don't care how, just do it, and we are not going to micromanage. So all the gating elements and things like that, we let the player figure out, and we just tell them what to do, not how to do it. All right. Lastly, reflections and lessons. So these are the sort of takeaways from this experience in my mind, and trade-offs that we had to basically wrangle, and that still kind of have stuck with me since then, because I don't think we solved all of them by any means. Drama versus replay. So how do you reconcile a replayable system with a dramatic telling of a story, right? Because again, like Prey, death was not canonical. You die and it resets, so you never actually canonically died. It just forked reality behind the scenes or something, right? You've got the Sands of Time sort of meta sort of elbowing you and saying, hey, we realize that this guy died. Oh, that's not the story, or that's not the way it happened. Let me tell the story again. So and we kind of accomplished that with our framing narrative. So in the framing narrative, you can't die because you're just isolated in a satellite and all that stuff. And so, it's a tricky one to solve. Next up, and this is a big one, and we did not, solve this by any means. We kind of sidestepped it a lot. And I don't know if we were trying to solve it necessarily, but drama versus agency. Like, what can you do to keep the player from messing up your, preciously planned narrative, right? The sort of Final Fantasy VII thing of why didn't you use a Phoenix Down or something like that. Assassin's Creed handles this by desyncing you, and then you get like Skyrim, where you can just put a bucket on someone's head and everything continues as normal, right? So this is something I became aware of much more in sort of stark relief, but I don't think we necessarily solved it. We had some handcrafted narrative bits, but they were more like flashbacky things that were individual characters, sort of storylines that were orthogonally kind of weaving through and on top of everything, but they weren't something you could potentially fail or mess up. Fidelity versus agency. So this is a tricky thing. In most games, the player just has guns for hands, like our friend Daniel Radcliffe here, and you get situations like the much panned press F to pay respects. In the funeral scene there, the player doesn't really have the verbs to actually express grief, because there's just shoot and duck and jump and things like that. Now, with something like The Sims, you can get these radial context wheels that give you that sort of expressive range, but it's a disconnect from the immediacy of a first-person game, right? So how do you solve that, right? You've got the concept of what I'm calling like interaction articulation instead of interaction scale, where it's like how fine-tuned can we push buttons and stuff like that. Interaction articulation is like how can you express different deeper feelings and thoughts and things like that, and then does the game have the receptors to sort of receive those, and how do you marry those two up? And it's tricky. Lastly, with the trade-offs, NPC fidelity. So and we sidestep this. In fact, a lot of immersive sims you will find are on mostly abandoned spaceships or space stations, and that's because NPCs are hard. That you don't, just shoot or whatever. But you get the situation where, like the higher fidelity a character is, then you get situations like, okay, this door, do we have them actually grab the doorknob, turn the doorknob and open it? And that's a huge headache to do in the high fidelity space. But if you look at something like Shadows of Doubt here, if a character walked up to a door and it just opened in that game, you'd be fine with it because everything is abstract enough, low resolution enough, that would probably work. And I've included the Understanding Comics. blurb about, the more abstract something is, the more you can sort of impress your own thoughts upon it. You can see here the example of people sitting in chairs as well. People sitting in chairs is a huge problem in immersive or in AAA games, right? And I think this is Star Citizen, but I'm not picking on them specifically because I've been in many projects where we had chairs and people, and it was a nightmare. But if you look at Dwarf Fortress, all you have to do to depict someone sitting in a chair there is just flash the two icons on top of each other, and that's person sitting in a chair versus, I don't know, they're standing on it because the capsule interrupted with the geometry of the chair, and the nav mesh is not built, and stuff like that. So the future, these are thoughts that came to me as I was working on it. It's like, wouldn't it be cool if, and then some projects I've seen, since then and stuff that have triggered thoughts about where these things could go. Looking at your sort of interaction model, back in the aughts or something, there was a game called Elebits that really struck me because you could use your Wii remote to sort of interact with the world in a more isomorphic way. I can twist something and it's actually twisting. It wasn't gesture recognition, which is hit or miss mostly. And then if you look at something like Alex or Boneworks or whatever, now that you've got these VR, interaction models where you can actually use your hands, you don't have to map all these things to a controller. You can say, I want to examine this. Oh, I'll examine it. I want to throw this. I want to drop it. I want to, take it apart or whatever. It's all more intuitive versus having to be mapped to something. So I think that's definitely really cool and useful for immersive sims and things like that. Next up is a sort of Moore's law inevitability of simulation, granularity and things like that. If you look at Noita, Teardown, things of that nature, you get these worlds that can respond very granularly and very consistently. So it's not just, oh yeah, we've got the one box you can set on fire. It's like, no, everything wood can be set on fire now. And now it becomes a design problem of, okay, what do we do with that? If you look at like the Red Faction Guerrilla problem of solving those destructible buildings and stuff like that, now it's in design's court to figure that out if you have these kinds of systems. And then lastly, you've got a lot of really powerful sort of procedural generation tools and polygon pushing at your disposal now. So something like the Dwarf Fortress mug that has 1,000 dwarves on it, all howling in pain or something, you could make that happen through something like Nanite in Unreal 5 or Houdini, where you can build entire apartment complexes just by dragging a box and clicking a button. I know it's more complicated than that, but those tools are sort of force multipliers for people that want to add more simulation and things like that to their worlds. And yeah, and that is it for me. There was I'm sure I blasted through some of that a little too quickly, but that's all I got. Special thanks to everyone on the Mooncrash team that was trying something new and sort of bearing their way through it, and Ricardo Bear for being my lead and collaborator on that, and Alexi and the team for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, this was really exciting for me, especially I don't think we talk about it as much here, but yeah, when you get into the question of, well, what about applying more roguelike elements to more AAA development? I think a lot of the stuff you touch upon with, Fidelity and that kind of conflict is, what actually comes up as the problem more than the question of should we do this or do we want to do this? A lot of the time, the interest is there. It's the how. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think Immersive Sims has been coming up a lot lately in a lot of different discussions. So it's a good time to talk about the links between the two.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I think if anyone wants to write a question real fast, but otherwise I guess, just lead it. And then I guess maybe if you just had to narrow in, and I know stuff on the fly is always hard, but kind of pick something roguelikey from some of your games you would have wanted to add to Mooncrash if you've been able to, or if it's easier to flip it and kind of take something from Immersive Sims you'd want to see in more of your favorite roguelikes. What do you think you might pick?
I think one thing I really wanted to incorporate more into Mooncrash was finding a way to bring in more people, more human beings to interact with and that sort of thing, like living characters that you could then bounce off of and interact with. That would have been really great. I think it was primarily a budgetary thing. If you look at something like Deathloop, they've got more characters and more sort of narrative kind of interacting with that. So
yeah, and maybe one other quick question. I'm curious if you have an off-the-cuff answer, but do you find that Immersive Sims lend themselves to any particular architecture? Is ECS, Entity Component System, a good match? Is there any kind of common pattern for doing Immersive Sims?
Component-based stuff definitely, because then you can say this thing emits fire. I'll just put it on this and this and this, and so that kind of thing. I think modularity definitely helps.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. All right, and that brings us exactly to time. So thank you so much, Rich, for talking. And I hope to see you around in the space.